So thank you very much. We are here today with Rajeswari Raina and with Bejoy Thomas. Rajeswari is in New Delhi, right? In Shiv Nadar University, and Bejoy is in the Indian Institute of Science, Education and Research in Pune. So first of all, thank you very much for accepting the invitation to have this interview for the International Society of Ecological Economics. And it's a pleasure to talk to you. We have a big time difference between Brazil and India, but unfortunately we could arrange this meeting. So thank you very much for accepting the invitation. So I think there is a lot of interest now in so-called emerging countries like Brazil, India, China. And first of all, because well, they are big countries, and they perform their economic and environmental performance will have global impacts and global consequences. And that has been my main motivation to talk to you, is to know more about what is going on in India and what would be the global impacts of those this path that India is following. If you look at India, at China and Brazil, for example, China has integrated into the world economy during the last 3 decades through manufacturing. And in Brazil, that integration has been through the export of commodities. And these two profiles are very different to the way India has integrated into the world economy. That has been through the service sector. We are mainly exporting services, different kind of services, especially related to information technology. So my first question for both of you, I mean, that would be that what are the environmental implications and social implications, I mean, the main implication of that kind of profile of the Indian economy as compared to Brazil or to China or other big economies, the service-intensive profile of the Indian economy. Do you think that will help to dematerialize the metabolism of the Indian economy, and or not? Is that immaterial profile will have an impact on your own environment in India and also on the global environment? What do you think? Maybe we can start with Rajeswari and then Bejoy can answer. If you want to start, Rajeswari.
Would you like to go ahead, Bejoy, or should I start?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks, Roldan. I mean, it's an important question and something that actually, well, in some sense, worries many of us who look at, well, the global impacts and the domestic impacts of India's service sector, right? Now let's look at this dematerialization argument that you just said. I mean, that for many of us, especially those of us who look at let's say the ecological economics questions, an information or let's say the IT industry driven economy will not, well, it's not really a question of reducing material intensity, right? That doesn't seem that's just, well, let's say wishful thinking, yeah? So a lot of, well, let's say, well, throughput questions that are disguised, yeah, that are not very evident, are still happening and are perhaps happening at a much faster pace. That is, the pace of throughput and entropy are increasing because of the information technology, or let's say the service sector economies that well, India is or economics that India is relying on. So I don't think a decoupling or let's say a dematerialization or anything is going to happen. It's just that we in India will probably, well, colonize our own states. For instance, some states like, well, extract more. When I say colonize, what I mean is convert them into extractive economies and push more of, well, let's say, an unequal and, well, unsustainable way of being on these states. Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Jharkhand, I mean, these are, of course, states from which you extract, well, endlessly, right? Now that will increase, definitely. Some of our, well, let's say, latest policies on the school blocks, for instance, are clear examples of this, right? So dematerialization is not going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen in India. And well, it's not just our government now, even previous governments. We're all about extracting more and producing more. And this IT, well, let's say, you still need material, right? I mean, food. I mean, our farmers are out on a protest right on the streets of Delhi, right where I live, right? It's a massive protest. The indifference of the state and of the Indian middle class population is amazing. Yeah. Now, you need food. Dematerialization is not going to happen the way we want. We well, theoretically assume it will. So I'll stop here and get back after Bejoy answers here. Thank you.
Well, I would like to respond to that question I would say, in two ways. So one, I would like to answer the question from a more normative premise to begin with. I'm sure we can revisit this issue later on. So the question is whether India should actually be going that way normatively is a question which I would like to pose. I mean, maybe it's a provocative question to begin with, because I mean, all of us understand the need for cutting down on greenhouse gas emissions and being environmentally oriented. But on the other hand, if you look at, say, for instance, pre-COVID and after COVID, so there's quite a bit of difference in the way responses happened in the north, in the global north, and also in the global south. So normatively, the point which I was trying to make was that when we look at this issue of ecologically fair and ecologically feasible futures for countries like India, we should also look at the issue of equity and justice, which is clearly embedded in these debates. And oftentimes, when there are two issues here. One, from an academic theoretical point of view, we can put forward several sets of arguments, for many of which with which we, in principle, can agree. But then, in a country like India, where equity is still a very huge concern, according to Chancel and Piketty, the study which came out a couple of years ago, 22% of India's income is occupied by 1% of the people. So there's a huge inequity which is happening historically happening in India since the 1980s. So and this also has an ecological implication in the sense that it is mostly the footprint basically comes from people who are affluent and people who are in the upper income deciles. So recently we did a quick analysis of the IHDS data set. So this was from 2012. I mean, slightly dated, but nevertheless very useful. And we found, very unsurprising results, which is that if you look at food, the consumption expenditure on food compared to luxury goods, you can see this difference. I mean, food really doesn't change as a proportion of your total expenditure, but then consumption on luxury items is quite huge. The footprint is quite huge as you move up the income deciles. So I think there's a huge inequity issue here. So on the one hand, you need to look at the bread and butter issues and of the rural folks, of the urban poor. But on the other hand, there is also this affluent minority urban middle class or the elite, which almost mimics the kind of living standards which are there in the West. So I think that is a normative question which I would like to pose in response to this. In principle, as a political practice, as an ecological futures, I think we might agree in principle on many of these issues. But then in practice, I think there should be some cushioning for countries like India or Brazil, where huge gaps exist in terms of income. So that is one thing. The second is these gaps are also accentuated by the fact that we don't have enough social security mechanisms. So that brings me to this post-COVID response which India had. After the lockdown happened, so there was mass exodus of urban rural migrants who have been laborers in urban settings back to their villages. And there was no real cushioning in the sense that there was no real security measures which were put in place to make sure that they are well fed, taken care of. So there was huge insecurity and uncertainty all over. So, that the images of people walking back to their villages is itself a stark reminder of this fact of inequity. And COVID lockdown, in fact, brought that, very much into the public debate. The images were for all of us to see. So the second point which I wanted to make related to ecological improvements is that side by side, along with this exodus of laborers, there was also a section of media and environmentalists who made this argument that after COVID lockdown, air quality has improved, water is becoming cleaner, and so on. So definitely we see, as environmentalists in that fraternity, we see some positive change there. But then, if you look at it again, going back to my first point, which is a normative point, so we have to see how this was achieved. This was achieved by forced lockdown with huge hardships for people who are at the bottom of the economic strata. So we need to really think whether the strategies that we are taking, the fundamental theoretical principles from which we are beginning, are really suited to some of these settings. I think we need to have a midway. I don't know what that midway is, but then we need to have a balance between equity and environmentalism when we approach issues for countries like India or Brazil or those emerging countries. So I think I would stop at that point for the first part.
Yeah, thank you very much. You mentioned a couple of changes that the pandemic has induced, and I think it showed very well the pandemic. It showed very well the importance of migrants for the urban economy. So I think probably that's one of the biggest transformation that is going on in India, is the massive urbanization of the country, migration, long-term migration from rural to urban areas. And of course, that's also related to changes in habits, in consumption patterns, and in diets as well. Here in Brazil, for example, there are very important consequences of Chinese changes in consumption patterns in terms of food. For example, the Chinese are eating more meat, and that requires, for example, soybeans that is cultivated here in Brazil and exported to China. And I would like to know more about these consumption patterns and how the changes in consumption patterns in India, especially related to food consumption. And I know that Rajeswari works on agriculture, and you, Bejoy, works on water, which is also related to food production. So I would like to know more about what are those consumption patterns, and how are these patterns changing in the long term, especially related to diets, and what are the implications for that for the agricultural sector? And for the first question, is India able to cope with those changes? The Indian agricultural sector. And secondly, what are the environmental implications in terms of water use and waste and all the environmental implications of those changes in consumption? Maybe we can follow the same structure, or Rajeswari can answer and then Bejoy.
Thank you. Thanks, Roldan. Yes, I do work on agriculture, but my work is mainly on what let's say as in ecological economics, we would call the real economy of agriculture. So I look at, for instance, changes in soil and water systems. Yeah, how does soil or land system, how do they become degraded? What are the kind of soil sciences? So look at the kind of research knowledge that goes into the making of that kind of science and so on. So basically an STS kind of work on soils, water, biodiversity, questions of that sort. Yeah. But in terms of well, let's say Indian agriculture and consumption, the food, agriculture, nutrition linkages in India have evidence that we have today show that there's a big, well, let's say, disjuncture or a break between these relationships. We assume that food is something that nourishes you, right? That doesn't seem to happen in India now, partly because of the Green Revolution, which, well, pushed two major cereals, rice and wheat, in a big way, yeah, and pushed those cereals in a way that further weakened the extraction that agriculture was anyway doing from the environment, right? So it further worsened the situation with reference to soil systems, water, the biodiversity of the food basket itself. Yeah? So there was a major set of changes of that sort that has, well, resulted in a decline in the quality of food, that is, in the ways in which food nourishes our population. So in terms of global hunger index and malnutrition indices, India is one of the worst ranked. Yeah? Meat consumption is increasing. Milk consumption is increasing, yes, but cereal, pulse availability and consumption are decreasing per capita. Now, these are all complex, well, pictures, right? Again, are some states doing better than the others? Yes, they are. What are the reasons? There are, well, ranging from, I also work with a big network in India called the Revitalization of Rainfed Agriculture Network. Again, so because my work is more, let's say, with networks and with communities that work on real problems, that is, real problems in real places with well, let's say, with real economy questions, that is, questions of material changes that are happening in the economy. One of the things that I have been saying in my own work is about how agriculture is no longer a primary sector in this country. Yeah. So when you talk about food, the quality of food is different because agriculture has become a net energy guzzler. I mean, we consume more energy than we produce. Globally also, that is the case with modern agriculture everywhere now. So what happens to an agriculture sector that produces food and fiber and so on for its population, yeah, sandwiched between two industrial sectors? It takes on the characteristics of that industrial sector. Unfortunately, that's not what food is supposed to do to our bodies and our ecosystems, right? So coming back to our question about what is the way in which Indian agriculture and food have changed, one of the, well, let's say, or why has it changed? One of the key drivers of change is development economics itself, right? Where development economics expects agriculture to dwindle. I mean, like one of our colleagues here in Bruno Doran talks about, well, what is expected is a world without agriculture. Ultimately, India's agricultural share should dwindle and dwindle and dwindle in the value added in the economy, IT industry and other sectors, service sectors should grow. That is what is expected, right? Theoretically, the sequential growth picture that has been given to us, the Lewis path, as Bruno Doran says, that's what's expected, right? So when you do that and you have a further thinning share, or let's say a steady thinning share of the economic pie on which more and more of your workers depend. So our workforce, 50% of our workforce, 53 to be precise, depends on agriculture, right? As main and marginal workers, that is cultivators and main marginal workers together. This 53% of our population depends on a steadily thinning share of the economic pie, of which, but let's assume last year it was 16% of the GDP, of which a significant chunk goes to industry of that value added, right? Industry that supplies fuel, chemicals, pesticides, yeah? So what you get into the farmers, well, hands, or survival, is again a further reduction of that share. So in terms of agricultural production, there's already a crisis. There's also a crisis in the quality of food. The kind of milk production and the kind of, well, let's say meat production that we have today, fortunately, is still very, very less energy intensive compared to, well, mainstream agriculture, that is rice and wheat and cotton and sugarcane production. That's a big blessing, because India's livestock sector is still very what you would call lean meat, yeah, as small livestock keepers, one or two heads of cattle, but again, a massive small ruminants sector, pigs, goats, and so on, poultry, massive again, and rapidly growing too. There is also a saying in this country more recently after our annual debacle of farmer suicides over the past 10, 15 years now, that no livestock keeper has killed himself or herself, right? So there's something about agriculture which livestock doesn't do. That is, livestock gives you ready cash, livestock keeps you going, that livestock also has a way of recycling what we would see as residue or waste or whatever, and producing food for you. So there is, in terms of your question about food and agriculture, it's a really complex picture, but one where it is increasingly clear that the given development economics theories don't seem to answer questions in Indian agriculture. And the state that goes down this path is actually creating, well, a very, very negative lock-in between, well, farming community and the state, which is what the tragedy that we're witnessing right now on the streets of Delhi, right? But also that this complex picture is one, increasingly material and energy intensive, except in some kind of sectors like livestock, like free range livestock that we have, yeah, small ruminant sectors that we have. So there's a lot of complexity, and there is also, again, urban India's consumption that is driving a lot of these. So the shift towards millets in some states today, that has been driven by urban India's demand for, well, the so-called highly nutritive, iron, well, potassium, phosphorus, all these other chemicals that are, micronutrients that are missing in the major cereals. The demand for millets is driven by the urban consumers. So there are some positive sides to it too, but then again, how will India cope with this? And if I have time, I'll come back more about the rainfed agriculture system, which is a very dynamic set of production systems and ends up producing 34 predominant crops. Yeah, we'll talk about that later if I have the time. I hope I've kind of answered it or didn't go overboard with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Bejoy, if you can comment on probably you work more on agricultural inputs, right? like water.
Yeah.
So it would be nice to know more about it, what is going on in that sector, in the water sector.
So yeah, my work has been on water for the last decade or so. Water in agrarian settings and also in peri-urban settings, and also how water is used in the city. So I think to complement Rajeswari, what I would say, what I would do is to take a maybe more micro level picture, because Rajeswari has now given a broad overview of how the broad situation in India, the general situation in India is like. So what I would do is I would try to draw upon some of the insights which I've gathered over the last few years from my work. So there are two aspects which I would like to touch upon. One, the issue of agriculture itself and the farmers' livelihoods. Second, the use of water. So in terms of farm livelihoods, I think, again, even as we really recognize the need for sustaining agricultural livelihoods, we also need to see the multiple pressures or the multiple stresses under which the farm livelihoods are built. Because the pressure which the multiple factors that affect the farmers in India are not just related solely to agriculture and then the related issues like marketing or producing or having insurance for crops and so on. it is also related to the changes that the system is witnessing. So you just a little while ago, you mentioned about India's shift to a more urban oriented system. So there are behavioral changes which are happening at a more micro level. So there are also systemic factors which actually push or suck people out from agriculture and bring them into the cities. So it need not always be the case that agriculture is a unviable, less profitable occupation. So it is that, if you go by economics, agriculture might still give you some normal profits or some surplus, and definitely some grains for you to for your own consumption. So it's definitely not the kind of surplus that you would get in a service sector occupation, and it has its own vagaries and challenges and uncertainties too. But then the problem is that at the micro level there are these push and pull which the farmers confront on a day-to-day basis. For instance, when we looked at the case of Bangalore, which is a big city in India, so which has really grown in the last 20-30 years, what we could find was that the farmers have been moving out of agriculture not just because of solely income or other factors. So this data is really preliminary in the sense that very cursory. The work was over, the work is over, the data is very cursory. But it is nevertheless an indication that the agriculture is not at a loss if you take the farm household economics as such. But then there's a feeling among agriculturists that the urban, the pull from the urban areas is worth taking, and then abandoning agriculture and then taking a service sector job is actually worth it, and that is where the future lies. So we've anecdotally, I could actually share several cases where, so even when your farm was very much intact and then you could still earn a surplus, people would take up jobs like working in an apparel factory or taking up a driver's job in the city, just to get out of the farming and the village setting. So I mean, so that's a micro level behavioral thing that you are witnessing. So the other is the shift which the urban areas are imposing on the rural areas, especially the ones which are sitting close to the city. So here it is not a behavioral or a esteem issue, or an attitudinal issue. So here it is more of a systemic issue. So here, for instance, so why is somebody in agriculture? Because the person has to make sure that at the end of the day, he or she and his or her household will have a surplus. And when you have specific demands come from the city in terms of maybe more demand for vegetables than grains, and more demands for flowers than other things, so you will have to basically adapt and adjust your cropping patterns and systems to cater to the new demand. And you can't really you can't really give incentives at the systemic level to make farmers stay on in staple crops, for instance. So what we have found in the Peri-urban Bangalore case is that there has been a huge shift from farmers over the last 20-30 years from more staple and finger millet and other kind of agriculture produce to more water intensive or urban centric vegetables and flowers and other things. So I think there is definitely, so farmers in India at the micro level are caught between this push and pull, which with the village setting on the behavioral and the attitudinal side, and also the more systemic pressures that the urban centers are actually putting on you. Second, in terms of resource use. So when we look at, so this is a huge problem, I'm sure, which is already there, which is going to intensify as we move into the future. So unless some serious efforts are made in that direction. So we see that agriculture has become much more water intensive in the sense that there has been more dependence on groundwater in many of these regions. And that has been the situation throughout India. And Indian agriculture definitely can't rely on rainwater itself. And especially in the peri-urban areas with the change in cropping patterns that one is actually responding to. So there is a tendency to rely more and more on groundwater and then dig deeper and deeper bore wells, or tube wells, bore wells as we call them in India. And this has put a huge pressure on the resource. And again here, systemic imposition of certain fee or a certain penalty or certain incentives cannot really work fully to keep the resource management intact. So I think that is another huge pressure that is being at the micro level the farmers are facing. So also when we look at the other side, there are also new kind of crops and patterns which are emerging. For instance, again, I'm talking from experience in working in peri-urban areas. So wastewater, which is used as a resource for which has free nutrients, which has been used as a resource by farmers in downstream peri-urban areas. So they use that for agriculture, for irrigation purposes, and many of these crops come back to the city in terms of as vegetables and for consumption. So I think at one level you have to make sure that the resource is kept intact, what you actually tap from the ground, but on the other you also have to make sure that so what the city is actually letting go in terms of the waste has to be also treated and then reused and managed well. So I think there are multiple things that farmers in broadly in the agrarian landscape, especially in the peri-urban settings that I talked about, face. So I thought this would be some micro level insights into what Rajeswari has been saying, what can actually complement what she has been saying. So I can revisit this issue later.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting development and very complex issue. And it's many elements, many different variables to take into account at the same time, and there is different scales of analysis at the same time. But it's very contrasting what Rajeswari said about the allocation of the population to the agricultural sector and its contribution to GDP, for example. If you look at Europe, for example, is I guess less than 1% of the population allocated to agriculture. In India, you said it's 53%. It's amazing. Yeah. So it's an extremely important sector for the population. That's it's becoming less and less important for the economy, because also probably will create a conflict, contradiction. But I mean, you know well that capitalism is full of these contradictions, and it seems that increasing inequalities has become one of the intrinsic features of liberal capitalism, and we are seeing that in India, and if I'm not mistaken, inequality is increasing steadily, has been increasing steadily for a couple of decades. And we are also seeing that in China. Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and so even though there has been a decline in inequality in Latin America in general, but there was a decline some years ago. Now it's increasing again. It's also accelerated by the pandemic. But we're also seeing it in high-income countries like the US. So we as social scientists I think are concerned about that trend. So because it's a possible scenario that India will become an extremely unequal place where you have a wealthy class that gets the benefit of the service economy, or the big chunk of the value added of the service economy, and a very large population with low skills and unable to integrate in a fair way into the urban economy. And that will create this conflict between the economic performance and the need of the majority of the population. So I wanted to ask you about, because we know that unless the government and the state interfere and through wealth redistribution mechanism systems, the tendency is to increase inequality. I mean, capitalism increases inequality, unless you have some wealth redistribution measures in place. But in democratic settings like India or Brazil, you need them to have democratically elected politicians who come with that agenda of wealth. I mean, with wealth redistribution. And that means that people in general have to have political preferences for reducing inequality. If we are talking in the case of Brazil, for example, which has been since colonization a very unequal country, and a very large part of the population, especially indigenous population and enslaved population, has been, has been segregated from the rights, the citizens' rights, even citizen rights of the that the elite was entitled. It seems that there is no, I mean, in the case of Brazil, it seems that there is no very strong preference for reducing inequality, that somehow inequality has been normalized by many people, including, I might say, a part of the poor population, the low-income population. For example, a large part of the low-income population in Brazil vote for conservative parties, which do not have reducing inequality top in their political agenda. It seems a contradiction, but it's like that. So my question is, how are those political preferences changing in India in relation to, well, make it more specifically in relation to inequality, and we can all add also to environmental issues, which is also a big concern. In Brazil, there has been a significant regression in the environmental agenda due to the political preferences of the people that are in power now. It has been democratically elected, and but which are openly anti-environmentalist. I mean, the current government in Brazil is openly, for example, openly denies climate change, and is openly against protected areas or indigenous lands, etc. I mean, it's been during the last 2 years an increase of deforestation allowed, but lacks enforcement of environmental laws by the government. So it's a very clear agenda of the government. And I'm not sure to what extent that reflects the preferences of the population, but that government was democratically elected. So somehow people choose that path. So my question is, what are your impressions about how political preferences are of the majority of the population? I say, I know that India is very complex. It's a continent. It's a huge and diverse country, and but well, you have a federal government with its own priorities and political agenda. And my question is, how do you foresee the future? I mean, you think that if people in general are getting more pro-environment, and they would prefer politicians that reduce inequality, or just people do not care much about those issues, and they put economic growth at the center of their political preferences? I would like to know more about what your impressions are on this issue.
Thank you, Roldan. I don't really work on these, but then I happen to live in this country, so you just can't escape hearing and actually witnessing these things. I mean, some of these tragedies that have played out right under our very noses now. So yes, let's say the yearning for growth and growth rate is still very, very strong. It's an obsession with the state. Yeah. And also, in some sense, a state that is, well, let's say, hollowed out from inside. I mean, it's not even thinking about the sustainability of the state itself in terms of what is a state meant to be. I mean, that is a state as, well, let's say, in terms of a territorial agenda, maybe protecting your borders, fine. But in terms of its domestic politics, what is the state? The state is today, it's so brittle. And because of its, well, let's say, gung-ho politics of so-called capital accumulation, again, in a very, very skewed manner, that is extremely skewed, and that which this country, since its independence, has never, ever witnessed before. That is, this kind of extremely skewed capital accumulation has been unprecedented in this country. That is, the state favoring it. Yeah. When I was a student, or maybe just as I was finishing my PhD, there were these papers which spoke with a sense of alarm that, well, in agriculture, which is a sector that I know best, the public subsidization of private capital formation in agriculture, they said, during the Green Revolution years, so the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, they said it was to the tune of about 30%, and it was considered, well, alarming. But after the 80s, till this was published as a paper published by Chandan Mishra in the 1990s, they said after the 80s, when the Green Revolution had ended, because at least the revolutionary jump in yields had ended, public subsidization of private capital was a tune of 80%. Yeah. Now, today that's not considered a shame. Today that's not considered an alarming factor. Today it's taken for granted that the state should work for capital accumulation for certain actors. Yeah. Now that is what is alarming, and it is quite like what you said is happening in Brazil. Yeah. So in terms of there is well, let's say very little. Perhaps there is awareness, but there is very little concern about, well, massive extraction, whether it is forests or coal or rivers. The Brahmaputra, which is one of the biggest rivers in this part of the world, perhaps will have more dams by the end of this century than any other river in the world. Yeah? Funded by the World Bank, supported by various, well, you know, thinkers of this sort, which would enable this kind of, well, disastrous construction. And it's not for lack of, well, data. It's not for lack of awareness. India, of course, was one of the leading participants in this World Commission on Dams, right? I mean, but this is continuing. Dams have become fashionable in this country because coal has become, well, you know, climate unfriendly. Yeah, but here again, what we're talking about is a politics that is willingly blind, which assumes that that this will all add to economic growth. One, we know that it will not, and two, as well, let's say William Garp or one of these earlier 1970s thinkers, or even Amulya Reddy in this country, in India, had said, you know, once GDP growth eats into or destroys the non-economic contributors to welfare, it's not going to come back. These are what Georges Kirojian would call irreplaceable losses. Yeah. Now, here again, is there a lack of evidence in India of this sort? There is plenty of published material. Some of our leading ecological economists in this country, I mean, good engineers, even bureaucrats have published on this. The point is that there is it's a political unwillingness to listen. And I'm not just talking about one particular government here, but the fact that there has been such a, well, let's say a massive centralization and consolidation of the economy with the union government that we don't behave like a federal state anymore. Even states have very limited accountability to their own state governments, to their own people. In agriculture, the only positive point, that is the biggest innovation that happened in Indian agriculture, came from the erstwhile planning commission. We don't have a planning commission now. We just do an ad hoc kind of, well, let's say, decision about disbursement of finances to various ministries. That's done by the organization called Niti Aayog, which has replaced the planning commission. But what is interesting was this innovation called the Rashtriya Krishi Vikas Yojana, which is basically, you know, in this kind of, like you said, a continent, agriculture was 100% central subject. That is, agriculture was entirely surviving on centralized schemes, that is central sector schemes and centrally sponsored projects, right? Now, the RKVY changed that. It is during the 11th plan, the government of India introduced a scheme which gave the state governments 25% of the allocation of the national agricultural budget to, well, of their state allocation to do what they thought was what the state governments would think was suitable for their respective states. Now that has been used to great advantage by some states. So Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, even Maharashtra, launched an integrated pest management program with that allocation. States like Rajasthan, when it was launched, they gave all the money to Monsanto, saying you supply hybrid maize, right? So there are different states that did different things, but some states have actually used it very, very well in a very socially, economically, and ecologically accountable manner. And that is amazing. So that there are positive sides to state governments taking up let's say guaranteed, written into the Constitution of India, that agriculture is a state subject. So there is a political movement, that is a political awareness within some state governments to claim that, responsibility and responsiveness this agriculture demands, and that political moment has changed. But here again, these are states where there are, for many decades now, there has been an accumulation of, neglected, excluded population groups, tribals, whose lands, whose forests have been taken over for extraction, for displacement, by dams, whatever. There are population groups that actually are aspirational groups now. They want education, rightfully so. So the state governments taking on more responsibility is a very positive sign that I see now. And hopefully that will be strengthened within the states, that is, as a deepening of democratic processes within these states itself, themselves. So I'll stop here. So it's a mixed bag, but basically, yes, there are some positive moments, but this obsession with growth is still very, very high. And for that sake, the nation state, that is the union government, is willing to sacrifice any amount of rivers, forests, extractive industries like coal and other minor minerals and metals and so on. Thank you.
You want to answer, Bejoy? Well, I know that's a very broad question, but and sensitive question maybe as well. But
yeah, so let me see. So I have, I don't have any disagreements as such with Rajeswari. I think, I'm on board with her on whatever she has said. So let me also try to bring in some additional dimensions here. So if you look at the trajectory of India post-independence, I would say that, being the very idea of what is underdevelopment and what is development, in Arturo Escobar's terms, the way they invented development actually happened in the 1950s. So, when we talk about obsession about GDP and obsession about development, so the philosophy, the idea, and the politics around it was so powerful that it has just completely decimated everything else from the 1950s. So, I don't actually see the post-independent Indian governments, any one of them, to be any different in terms of orientation as far as the objective of progress towards the objective of growth or environment, not really caring for the environment is concerned. I think so that starts from the Nehruvian time, from the 1950s itself. So, but then I think in terms of the progress towards the wide scale, large scale disruption of the environment and the systems. So I think that happened towards the mid 1980s, I would say. Because again, I would bring in a couple of other global and regional factors in here. One is definitely there was a movement towards a more market-oriented, liberalization-oriented policies around the world from the late 1970s. So in India, the first signs of such movement happened in the mid 80s. So I think it is also during that time onwards, again, going through several literature which is available, including Chancellor and Piketty's now famous work. So it is from around 1980s, mid 1980s, that this turnaround happened in terms of inequity and more widespread disruption of environment. So until that time, it was slow and steady, but then still manageable, I would say. So that is one aspect. The second is in terms of how the inequity has been changing over the last few decades. So I think once that global changes started affecting India, and then once our economy also got liberalized in the early 1990s, so then there was no real looking back. So I think once we opened it up, we were sure that this is going to just unleash everything to the market forces. which would definitely, as nature being the biggest resource, so definitely it's, you can expect that natural resources would be affected, and then those would be extracted, and there are no real ways in legal or otherwise to really counter it. So on the second point, which you raised about democracy, so again, I'm not really sure if the average person who goes out and votes for a particular political party is very much influenced by environmental concerns or even broader development concerns. So I think to a large extent, micropolitics and other factors work. So bread and butter issues definitely are a vote winning mantra, in addition to all sensitive matters that one could bring up. But so definitely in terms of, for an ordinary person, forest or water or such natural resources are to be used and not to be conserved in that sense. So I think so if there is a choice between your daily bread and butter and the environment, I think so definitely, I mean, it is an so there is no real debate about that question, because people would want to just go at that level, especially since a large chunk of the population still relies on very minimal endowments for their at their households. So even at that higher level, so that's what I was trying to refer to in the beginning. So the higher deciles consume several times more what the lower deciles consume, from whatever data that we have been analyzing in terms of their consumption of luxury goods. So I think when we talk about impact on environment, I think so we need to really have some separation between who is actually contributing more and which group. So I think a blanket targeting at India as a whole, as being moving towards an environmentally unfriendly manner, I think that's not a very useful position to maybe take and then approach the issue. I think you need to really look at the different categories. So there are many different. So I would say that there are several mini Europes or mini USs in India, so which have to be targeted. So even when you talk about, say, degrowth and moving towards more environmentally friendly practices, I think the groups that should be targeted should be from the top deciles downwards, and not from the bottom up. So I think so this is also, I think, a danger which we as ecological economists and concerned scholars actually face, because when we try to make these grand theories, whether it is about degrowth or whether it is similar ideas, we try to put it across in a very general terms, that it sometimes even makes our sympathizers or our friends somewhat disappointed or disappointed with us, or even sometimes they might even become forced. So I think we should not really throw the baby out with the bathwater when we when we air our environmentalist concerns. And so I think going back to the question of democracy, I think democracy works in India and as elsewhere in the developing world as a bread and butter issue, and not really something which has to do with environmentalism and environmental concerns as a primary focus. So even when we articulate as scholars, I think we have to be quite mindful and sensitive about this, the large constituency of people who are trying to meet their ends. We have to have them on board while we articulate this. So this is where these are my points with respect to that question.
Can I just come in, Roldan, for
Sure.
a minute? Just for 1 minute, because I would like to say a bit about, but yes, I mean, I completely agree that there is an extremely diverse, consumption equation here, where our top deciles consume just like somebody in, some of the top deciles in Europe or the US would consume too. I mean, again, Sachs saying that the top or the elites of different parts of the world will behave alike anyway, and so we do that. So my argument about this degrowth, post-growth, as this book that Julian and I did we talk about, is is, well, let's say, is inclusive, like a converging movement of degrowth, stabilization, alternative flourishing, and so on, with a selective degrowth of some sectors and a very conscious growth of some other sectors. And that is something that can be decided only in an, well, what we would see as an economic democracy, that is an, as Ashish Kothari and others would call it, a radical ecological democracy. Yeah. So there are living examples of, for instance, Mendalekha and other, well, let's say small constituencies, small, well, regions, eco-regions, forest fringe villages, where there is ecological democracy that's practiced. So to my mind, and to several others who work with us on this Rainfed Agriculture Network and other networks that talk about growth, there is this question of selective growth. For instance, not just in India, Asian agriculture itself. I mean, Asia, with, again, many countries which have a similar problem of a thinning share of agriculture in the economy, but a high proportion of their population still depending on agriculture. It offers scope for what Georges Kurojian would call a Georges knowledge-based bioeconomy, right? And that is why a post-growth thinking is important for us. A selective degrowth of the kind of exploitative and, well, let's say, resource guzzling industrialization and urbanization can actually change in this 21st century if we have, well, if we put some of our history in front of us and say, well, structural transformation, well, theories of structural transformation, sorry, it doesn't seem to work in this part of the world, right? The much desired, you know, I mean, people are watering in their mouths for the Lewis path, right? Didn't happen. Yeah, it's unlikely to happen here. Yeah, because the kind of material and energy intensity per worker for worker productivity to increase, like the Lewis path would let's say prescribed to policymakers, doesn't seem to happen here. Yeah, so if we have our ability to, well, the abilities to look at these histories of the 1950s onwards and take the 21st century forward, then agriculture, in not just in India, in Asia itself, offers a very different, well, let's say, a global order. Yeah, it offers opportunities to address some of these, well, pressing national and international employment problems. Instead of substituting and displacing work and technology, intelligent work and technology, that what David Ludden, the historian, would call as the Velanmai, or let's say the knowledge and the ability to confront of that is vested with a rainfed farmer. If you replace that with chemicals and machines, that's a loss. That's your structural transformation path. But if you bring back this so-called work and technology embedded in human beings back to agriculture, more employment opportunities, agriculture and non-farm employment as rural industrialization, there is scope for that. So post-growth thinking involves these kinds of things. Bring back Gandhian Buddhist economics. Yeah, well, Tagore, I mean, there are people who've spoken about this, a universal labor-intensive growth. I mean, that's possible. So there is scope to do that, employment concerns. The other is, of course, the shift, the theorization of agriculture that we can do from this linear sequential transformation to mutually reinforcing nested circles of value creation. We can do that. Yeah, there are small niche ecosystems that have proven that do work in that fashion. But for the state to take it up and to scale it up, that is what is important. So here again, coming back to this post-growth thinking as alternative flourishing, as selective degrowth of some sectors and, well, growth of some other sectors, we need to think of, as Bejoy said, alternative institutional mechanisms. And these are the only ways to get out of inequality. Otherwise, there will always be, you know, ecosystems, people that survive on this really poor quality environment and poor lives with working with, well, fragile ecosystems. And there will be a layer that is sitting on top and gaining from this. Yeah? So we need to break that with a different kind of structural change. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems to be the key issue. I mean, what you mentioned about the intensity of labor, of capitalism, and the intensity of resources of capitalism. So this eternal contradiction of capitalism that, you know, workers need a labor-intensive economy, and capitalists have a strong incentive for reducing the labor force and reducing labor costs. So Marx already talked about that, and we haven't solved that. I mean, I mean, we as the planet, the capitalist planet, we haven't solved that issue. So, but then I guess many interesting examples might come up with from different parts of the world. And then maybe to finalize, as in a positive tone, and I would like to know more very briefly, because we have to come to an end. We have already almost an hour the interview. To thank you again for being here and talking about this interesting subject. So my last question is about what positive experiences and cases and movements, social movements you are witnessing in India that we can learn from in other parts of the world. Maybe you can mention an inspiring innovation, inspiring social movement in India that we can learn from, especially in urban areas, because I think that it's pretty clear that, well, first of all, urban cities are, cities in India has experienced very big transformation in just a couple of years, and this last decade, cities like Bangalore, Pune has been transformed. And I guess that the future is also in the cities. I mean, there's no way to stop the migration that Bejoy mentioned from rural to urban areas. That is unstoppable in India. So I would like to know more about what you see as interesting innovations in cities in India that we can study and we can learn from to maybe apply in other parts of the world. And well, thank you very much again for your time, for being here. So maybe we can start with Rajeswari and your last words.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I mean, there are, again, given the current crisis, I mean, with a very strong, well, let's say a gung-ho government that is bidding its decisions down as midnight announcements and not a parliamentary process of decision-making. There have been several crises that this country is facing. And among them, I mean, right now, this farmers' protest gives a lot of hope that there is a voice out there that will not take, well, injustice just lying down. So there is a lot of hope there. But there's also, I mean, this is again a very sad moment, because I mean, our farmers should not have to do this. That is, as a state, we shouldn't be pushing our farmers to this. What gives hope? What are the other alternatives? There are several environmental movements. I mean, Vikalp Sangam is a very strong group of, well, alternatives, a flourishing of alternatives that are coming together and raising their voice about a lot of issues. And there are lots of young people participating in this, which is a very, very positive moment for us, because India, with its demographic dividend, I think the youth today have a lot more engagement with issues of the environment, climate change, and the ways in which their own unemployment stares them in the face, right? I mean, so they are far more aware. So I'm very, very enthusiastic about these youth-led climate movements. And where do I come in? I talk to some of them, yes, but I also bring in some of this in my teaching. So, for instance, in my courses, environment, economy kind of relationships, I teach the environmental social sciences, the entire, well, let's say about 9 or 10 of them, and say what they are, where do they come from, where are they headed, so that the youth of well, let's say the next leaders of the next generation will also be aware of some of these. Yeah, that is the histories of these disciplines itself. So, for instance, in ecological economics, I help them think about, well, think not just about the difference between ecological economics and environmental economics, between post-growth and A-growth. I mean, those are things that is for us, for the academics to debate. But the key things are to go out there and work with people, real places, real issues, real concrete problems where, for instance, the Orissa Millet Mission embodies some of the, ecological economics principles. Yeah, work with some of them, bring in some of these principles into practice in a state government, in its agriculture policy. Yeah, there is an Orissa, rain-fed agriculture platform that they're putting up now. There again, bring in some of the substantialism that we can bring in. So that's the direction that some of us are taking now, and I think that is really, really important for us as a country now to engage with. I'll stop here, and thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you. And like you said, it was as informal as you said it would be. So thanks.
Yeah, so I would be very brief. So I agree fully with Rajeswari. I think she already mentioned the few hopeful movements that we are seeing at present. So the Vikalp Sangam she mentioned, and she also mentioned the Orissa Millet Mission. So these are all, at some point you think that, so there are changes which are happening and this could be isolated and in small pockets. But I think, as a collective, so many of the smaller movements can actually, every drop counts. So I think eventually, so these are all small signals that the current system is getting. I think that would make a long way in making this case forward. And the other thing which I also wanted to highlight is that there is also this awareness among people. At the end of the day, some kind of trigger, some kind of nudge, some kind of behavioral change actually makes a lot of difference. So I think at individual levels, our own respective spheres, wherever we are in whatever we do. So I think that individual, the personal change also really matters. So, in my own career trajectory, I've come from hardcore economics to development studies and then to environment and development. So, Robert Chambers, when he was articulating participatory methods, he used to say, you need to have a professional and personal change. So professional change, he was referring to methodologies in development research, and personal change, all the attitudes and also the way you approach your setting and also the tools that you use. I think we also need some level of personal change, the way we deal with and think about environment and such issues, especially in this part of the world where we are faced with, so we can't be degrowing completely. We have tough choices, but then I think even small drops that way really count. I think that would be my last comment. And thank you so much, Roldan, for this opportunity. And I really enjoyed talking with you and Rajeswari.
Well, thanks again to both of you. I think the contribution of India to the world has been, many fields, in art, in culinary, including culinary art, in philosophy, in mathematics. I hope that we still can learn a lot from your own experience as such an old and wise culture. So thanks again, and then I hope that many people can enjoy this conversation, and we will upload in the website and YouTube channel of the International Society for Ecological Economics. And I hope to meet you personally soon after the pandemic. It has been a while that I have not been to India, and I would like to experience myself with all the changes we are going through. So thanks again.
Thank you. And I sincerely hope you will visit and be with us for some time. Yeah.